Senior U.S. and Chinese officials meet on Thursday to discuss trade for the first time in months. And U.S. President Donald Trump says he's confident of a breakthrough.
Well, they want to make a deal. They're down 3.5 million jobs since we started doing what we do. And their supply chain is really cracked and broken, and they want to make a deal. Now, they're coming to see us on Thursday and Friday. We think there's a chance that we could do something very substantial, Bob. I think.
His optimism comes after Washington stepped up pressure on Beijing this week. The U.S. has announced visa restrictions against Chinese officials involved in suspected abuses against Muslims in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. That's a day after Washington blacklisted 28 Chinese entities, including 8 tech firms, for supplying the surveillance equipment used at some of the holding facilities. Beijing has called the U.S. measures an attempt to interfere in China's internal affairs.
The measures taken in Xinjiang aim to prevent extremism and terrorism at the source. These measures are fully in line with Chinese law and international practice.
The trade dispute between the world's 2 largest economies has entered its 15th month, and organizations like the IMF and the World Economic Forum warn it could cost the global economy hundreds of billions of dollars.
The cumulative losses of trade conflicts could get us to about $700 billion by 2020. This is around 0.8% of global GDP. Not something to sniff at.
According to the World Economic Forum's latest Global Competitiveness Index, the U.S. has slipped to the number 2 spot behind Singapore, partly because of the dispute.
What is having as an impact, for sure, is the uncertainty, the mood, the business sentiment, not just in the U.S., but the world.
Despite the new bitterness brought by U.S. sanctions, Chinese officials are entering negotiations with a multi-billion-dollar sweetener. They're planning to offer to increase purchases of American soybeans. China hopes that will soften the U.S. position and help end the trade war. Paolo Montecillo, TRT World.
Well, for more on this, let's go to Jeffrey Tucker in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He's the editorial director of the American Institute for Economic Research. Welcome back to Money Talks, Jeffrey. Now, what could a partial trade deal possibly look like? What issues would it resolve?
I think in the U.S. case, in Trump's, which means in Trump's case, what he really wants is more purchases of U.S. grain, because we have too much of the stuff and we're looking for markets. And from a mercantilist point of view, exports are always a good thing. Imports are almost always a bad thing. So the goal is to get rid of the so-called trade deficit as calculated according to the country of origin. And I think that's all that Trump's thinking about. Honestly, you know, reasonable people might believe that a trade deal consists of getting rid of, for example, tariffs and barriers to trade. But that's not really what we're talking about here. If you understand the way Trump's mind works, this is all about U.S. exporting to China. That's the only thing he's interested in, and everything else is basically irrelevant. But I'm so sorry to say this. There's not going to be any change on these tariffs. And you notice that going into these negotiations, the U.S. is already sending these signals, you know, with new export controls, and these restrictions on visas for China's officials. These are very draconian actions that the U.S. is taking just days ahead. So it's getting, in many ways, it's getting worse and worse.
Yes.
What's interesting to me to see how Wall Street gets excited about any news of any talks whatsoever. It's like Wall Street's the starving dog that's happy for a few crumbs thrown its way every once in a while.
Well, that's right. I want to talk about the market reaction, because we did see markets around the world rally at the prospect of even a partial trade deal. Is that a sign that perhaps investors have all but given up hope for a full resolution to this trade war?
Yeah, so here's the thing. I don't think investors have given up hope. And my opinion is that the financial markets have been in a state of denial, not just for these 15 months, but for actually 2 or 3 years, about the real agenda of the Trump administration. And I've been, as you know, Oscar. I've been very pessimistic about all this stuff from the beginning, mainly because, I listened to the campaign promises. I know how Trump thinks. He's been a protectionist now for 30 years. He has called himself a tariff man. He believes that these things are good for the U.S. economy. He thinks that the weakness in the economy right now is due to, and maybe you know this, but he believes that the economy is weak right now because he's being threatened with impeachment. He actually believes this.
Interesting.
So even though the World Economic Forum says no, it's tariffs, the Fed says it's tariffs, the WTO says it's tariffs, every competent economist in the world says these tariffs are killing us. They're driving down world GDP and harming the U.S. especially, and also of course China too, but everywhere else, unpredictable effects. I don't think that there's anybody in the White House who's really willing to recognize that Trump has been wrong about this from the very beginning. So I am not optimistic about these talks. I think the best that's going to come out of them is maybe a slight cooling in the interest of more U.S. exports. But in terms of reducing the barriers, in terms of turning down this the war, ending the ridiculous attack on Huawei and so on, I don't think that there's any hope for any fundamental shift off this path. And it's very. There's an element of tragedy here because the economy was doing very well after Trump got elected, actually, as a result of tax cuts and deregulations and, a fresh look in Washington. There was some pro-energy policies that were taking place. It was all good. And then began the trade war, and then began the slide. And it's an amazing thing to see how a bad theory can kind of just doom an entire presidency and even drag down the world economy to the point that billions of people are suffering. And I think it's going to get worse. In fact, I don't think we've seen anywhere near the worst of it. And even more alarming than that, I think it's even if you get a complete reversal of the policies of the last 15 months, it's going to take another 2, 3, 5 years to recover from the damage that's been done, unfortunately. I'm sorry to be so gloomy.
Yeah.
I get on the show and say terrible things all the time.
There's a dire prediction there, Jeffrey, but we'll see in the more immediate term how these talks unfold on Thursday and Friday. But good to have you on the program as always, Jeffrey Tucker from Massachusetts.
My pleasure.